Okay, so we're going to start with chapter 4, and something to keep in mind is that as I go through these PowerPoints and these videos, you guys need to be focusing not only what is coming up on the screen, but also keep in mind you should be keeping track of what I'm actually saying, because I'm going to say some stuff that may not necessarily be written word by word up on the PowerPoint. So we are looking at chemical energy and ATP. So the take-home messages that you need to keep in mind as you go through this section is the being able to recognize the importance of ATP as an energy carrying molecule, and hopefully you'll be able to identify energy sources used by organisms. So all cells need chemical energy. We spoke a little bit about chemical energy back in Chapter 2 when we talked about carbon-based molecules, the carbohydrates, the lipids, the proteins, and the nucleic acids, and we talked about primarily how carbohydrates and proteins use chemical energy. So we're going to go into that a little bit more in this section. So chemical energy used for the most cell processes is carried by ATP. Molecules in food store chemical energy in their bonds. So we as humans eat food to gain energy, but the actual food that we are eating, for example, if you are like me and had turkey on Thanksgiving Day, it's not the actual turkey that's giving us the energy. It's actually our bodies digesting that food and breaking it down into those carbon-based molecules, again, those carbohydrates, those proteins, those lipids. And when they have those bonds that are made in those molecules, that's what, when we break those bonds, that's when we're going to get the energy needed for the cells. So ATP up here stands for adenine tri, as in 3, triphosphate. So ATP transfers energy from the breakdown of food molecules to cell functions. So essentially when you have ATP, which you can see down here in the picture, and when you take off a phosphate or you remove a phosphate, energy is released, for example, going to cell functions, and then you end up with adenine di, as in 2, diphosphate. So those 2 phosphates. And you can go from ATP to ADP when we remove the phosphate, energy is released, and then you can go from ADP to ATP, which is when a phosphate is added and energy from the breakdown of molecules is added, and we get again that ATP, that triphosphate. So organisms break down carbon-based molecules to produce ATP. Carbohydrates are molecules that are commonly broken down to make ATP. And carbs aren't really stored in large amounts, and they use up to 36 ATP from one glucose molecule can be made. And as you can see here on this diagram, fats store the most energy, getting 80% of the energy in your body, about 146 ATPs from a single triglyceride. Proteins are least likely to be broken down to make ATP, and that's typically because the amino acid, or the amino acids that cells can break down to make ATP, are needed to build new proteins more than they are needed for energy. So the proteins we're using to make more proteins. So there are a few types of organisms that do not need sunlight and photosynthesis to as a source of energy. Obviously, for those who have been exposed to this type of material before, photosynthesis means, photo means sun, and so there are some organisms that don't get sun. I'm talking deep, deep down in the ocean. They they don't really get a lot of sun in the deep, dark depths down there. So instead, they have what we know as chemosynthesis, and this is a process by which some organisms use chemical energy instead of light energy to make energy-storing carbon-based molecules. That's a mouthful. You might want to rewind and listen to that again. And keep in mind that these organisms still need ATP for energy, these organisms that use chemosynthesis. The process that makes their ATP is very similar to those in other organisms. Like plants, chemosynthetic organisms make their own food. It's essentially the raw material that is different. So this is a pretty short section. I think it's about 3 pages in your book, not even. So keep in mind that there is one high energy ATP molecules, and then there are lower energy ADP molecules. ATP has 3 phosphates, ADP has 2 phosphates, and the types of molecules that are broken down to make ATP include carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. And that's about it for this particular section.